नमस्कार। इस बार कुछ नया कहने को मन करता है मेरा। छोटी थी तब एक कविता पढ़ी थी मैंने। तूफानों की ओर घुमा दो नाविक निज पतवार। लहरों के स्वर में कुछ बोलो, इस अंधड़ में साहस तोलो। कभी कभी मिलता जीवन में तूफानों का प्यार। तूफानों की ओर घुमा दो नाविक निज पतवार। ये असीम निज सीमा जाने, सागर भी तो ये पहचाने। मिट्टी के पुतले मानव ने कभी न मानी हार। तूफानों की ओर घुमा दो नाविक निज पतवार। हम सब ईश्वर के आशीर्वाद और गुरु महाराज की प्रार्थना के कवच में लिपटे सुरक्षित रहे। निसर्ग आया और यहीं कहीं इधर उधर धूम मचाता हुआ अपनी यात्रा पर आगे बढ़ गया। And here we are once again, energized, hale and hearty, on the platform of Pavitra to embark on a new and fascinating journey. It's unique in many ways. It's that rare moment when our children surpass us and do us proud. Today, once again, and I wonder if this has happened before in Pavitra's journey, that the speakers have been invited twice to present their research, which is path-breaking in many ways. Without much ado, let me introduce you to the two beautiful ladies, spunky and intelligent, intellectuals in their own right. Brinda Kotak has graduated from the University of Pennsylvania with a double degree with majors in biological basis of behavior and science, technology, and society. Following this, she completed her master's degree in healthcare policy and management from Carnegie Mellon University. As an eager exponent of Bharatiya culture, she set up the Pen Bhakti Yoga Club and was also an active member of the Hindu Students' Council in her universities. Brinda has since been a consultant with PricewaterhouseCoopers and a health tech entrepreneur. Her passion lies in empowering Bharatiya youth through debates and discussions around Vedic perspectives on several social, cultural, and religious issues in contemporary Bharat. And dear Gayatri, Gayatri Manchella, I told her that, we're so sorry. We are waking her up so early in the morning. So good morning to you, Gayatri. And she's a rising senior in her undergrad at Carnegie Mellon University, studying mathematics and statistics. She's also doing research in digital humanities, which is the analysis of trends in literature published online. Currently, she's working on how Western literature has been influenced by the Sanskrit language and Indian culture. Having been born and raised in the US and educated in a place with a very left-leaning mindset, she's very passionate about establishing the right narratives about Hinduism and educating people about the rich culture and history of India. In her free time, she tutors kids in math and volunteers at the women's shelter for the domestically abused in Pittsburgh. Wow, both of you. I'm deeply impressed. And let me tell you, you have a fan in me because while going through the previous recording, I realized I really don't know. I know so little, you know so much more. And I wish, we could have a warm round of applause for both of you. You can visualize that and you can hear it because, yeah. And welcome to Pavitra. And all the participants are very eager to hear all about your research on menstruation, the way it has been projected in our Shastras, and how you debunk the various myths clouding the reality, and how progressive Indian culture has been and is, and I think will always continue to evolve with times. So welcome to the platform. And Brinda and Gayatri, just a personal question before we begin with the seminar. I want to know why you took up this subject of menstruation. Was there a personal experience? What was the trigger point?
For me personally, it's been not something, not one specific incident, but rather accumulation of multiple things that have happened over the years, actually. And because growing up in Mumbai, in urban India, I've often been inundated with statements like Hinduism is misogynistic and Hinduism considers women impure because they menstruate. And I, as a practicing and active Hindu, knew these to be false. But unfortunately, I realized that many of my peers did not. And even when I went to further my education in America, on both my campuses, I saw the same trend of people not really knowing, not really understanding Hindu Shastras at all, because they hadn't read it, because they hadn't been exposed to it, and therefore then they were extremely susceptible and vulnerable to anything that was being told to them about Hinduism. So that's where this came up from, this impetus to learn more and to actually go straight to the source, which is our Shastras. And then once we went through the source, then we also looked at how this has historically and culturally evolved over time, how those Shastras have been imbibed into Indian society, and how those Shastric principles are being implemented today, if they are at all. And that's what has brought us here to this point.
Oh, yes, yes. Oh, so that was a major. And has it been really? I'm sure it must have been a very challenging task to go through this wide gamut of shastras. Gayatri, how did you guys manage it?
So we've basically understood that there like we're gonna mention in the presentation, there are so many facets in which Hinduism is in which menstruation is discussed under the umbrella of Hinduism. So we decided to take up like common misconceptions and common myths and how menstruation is reflected in the 21st century, like cooking, going to the temple, like all these cultural norms we have. What exactly are those precedents? So we just did some research into those specific fields, especially because my experience has always been that being born and brought up in the West, anything that isn't Western is looked down upon as like oppressive or very mean and regressive. So menstruation isn't something that escapes that, right? So it's very hotly debated. So we just wanted to understand why these norms have come about and what the scriptural precedents are for those.
For me, you girls are really brave. And I'll tell you why. Because even now, our generation finds it very difficult to talk so freely about menstruation. And there's a certain amount of shyness because that's how we've grown up. I remember as a child, and that's a very personal thing I'm sharing with you on this platform. If my mother hears it, she's going to spank me. So when I had my periods for the first time in class 8, I went to my father and I said, Dad, मेरी kidney खराब हो गई है. And I still remember it was 8:30 a.m. in the morning. He was in front of the mirror shaving and he just paused, looked at me, and now I can recollect he was almost bursting with laughter. And he had a very amused look and he said, well, mummy ke paas jao. So that's how it began for us. And I find now young girls talking about it, researching about it, and it's so wonderful because, we were floundering and sex education was a taboo. And it left us in rough waters with several traumatic experiences. So now let's begin. And I'm very eager to listen to your presentation, to go through it because I wasn't there the last time you did it. And yes, so let's begin. And I want to know where and how did menstruation come up in Hindu scriptures? Yes.
Perfect. So thank you so much, first of all, to the entire Pavitra team for having us here. It's a great honor for us and a privilege to be here. Um, So let's get right into it. The goal for today's session is to look at one very specific aspect of Indian culture, and which is surrounding menstruation, and then look at how it has been maybe misused, abused, or used correctly over time, historically, culturally. And we can start going down that journey by looking first at the Shastras, clearing some of the misconceptions around that, and then as we move on, we'll move on to more cultural issues and more contemporary issues around this topic. So in the context of Hindu Shastras, menstruation appears in our Shastras a lot. It is discussed in great detail on several different levels in several different contexts. For instance, it is talked about in the context of health and wellness in yoga and Ayurveda. It is talked about in terms of cosmic energy and forces in the Jyotish Shastras. It is talked about at a physiological level in the Kama Sutra, and in all other Shastras, menstruation does show up in terms of spirituality, in terms of dharma, in terms of spiritual growth. So right away here, right, one myth about Hinduism is already busted, that Hinduism treats menstruation as this hush hush taboo subject that should not be spoken about. In fact, Shubhaji just talked about her own experience where she did face this situation where there was no communication systems surrounding menstruation. Our Shastras are completely opposite of that. They are so open about menstruation. They are very objective, they are honest, and they are not afraid at all. And it's very much in the open public discourse. This is not in some secret book in a secret vault that is kept hidden away. So the only barrier is actually the fact that Hindus or Indians themselves don't have access to the Shastras, or are not researching or not reading Shastras, and therefore they don't have access to this knowledge that is already there for us. But this is not the central conflict, around menstruation. Where the central conflict around the narrative about menstruation arises, particularly in the Hindu context, is from this seeming paradox about how Hindu women are talked about or treated. So on one hand, it seems to be that Hindu women are given very high positions. There's a lot of inherent divinity seen in the feminine form and femininity itself, and women are considered embodiments of Shakti. However, on the other hand, some people claim that Hinduism sees menstruation as impure, and therefore all women are impure, and women are, recently a Bollywood celebrity made a comment about how Indian women are treated as second class citizens and have always been treated as such. So there seems to be this paradox, which is the central issue around menstruation, that menstruation and therefore women are impure. So let's get right into this. Before we give you the correct perspective, let's first understand why this perspective might be slightly skewed or wrong. And the misconception arises from this very unfortunately used word called ashaucha. Hindi speakers in the audience would already know what ashaucha is. It roughly translates into unclean. In fact, we use the word shauchalay for bathroom as well. But the problem with ashaucha is that it appears in the context of menstruation in Hindu Shastras only and only to describe discarded menstrual blood. It does not refer to the process of menstruation itself. It does not refer to women, and it certainly does not refer to all of womankind. Now, to just put this in context, the word ashaucha, the same word, is also used for all bodily excreta, including urine, feces, and even sweat. So the argument that these historians are making is equivalent to saying that anyone who sweats is also considered impure. That's not true at all. No, sweat might be impure, sweating is not, and the person who's sweating is certainly not. Menstrual blood, which has been discarded by the body, is considered a shaucha or unclean, but that does not mean that the process of menstruating itself is unclean, or and certainly the woman who's menstruating is not unclean, right? There is a complete disassociation between these three things that we have to understand. But unfortunately, there have been three ways in which this word ashaucha has been so badly appropriated. Number one, in what the term actually means, they use ashaucha to mean impure. Like that, it does not mean impure. In fact, there is very few words that even can be translated to ashaucha, and ashaucha in turn cannot be translated into one particular word in the English language, but the closest that we can come to it is unclean, and that's very different. It has very different connotations from the word impure. And again, where it is used, like I said, ashaucha is used for several things. So if we take ashaucha to mean impure, literally every human being is considered impure, which is of course not the case. So it is not just for women also, but ashaucha is used for men in many circumstances. So clearly there's a dichotomy here. And what it is used for, again, ashaucha applies to just the removed blood. It does not apply to the process, which in fact is considered very holy and very natural, and very healthy in fact. But and it certainly does not apply to a person who's menstruating.
Yes. So where does this problem arise? If we understand as Hindi speakers that this term doesn't always mean impure, where does the problem come up, right? So the problem here is that using the term ashocha in Western or the scientific view is very different from the Eastern view, and specifically like Vedic psychology and science. So for example, the most prominent difference in these both views is that Western view views humans as just like physical individuals with a physical brain, and the idea of the mind and consciousness are used interchangeably. However, in the Vedic view, individuals have 5 different layers of individuality that are all integrated with one another. So the mind and consciousness are completely different, but they're integrated at a bodily physical level. So while the Western view will limit us at just the body and mind, the Hindu view has 5 different layers that has a body, mind, and consciousness model. So what exactly are these 5 layers, right? So these 5 layers are the panchakoshas. So at the very bottom, we have your Annamaya kosha, then your Pranamaya kosha, which is your life air, and then you have your Manomaya kosha, your mind, you're controlling your thoughts. Then you have your intellect, and this is all separate from your body, right? Your intellectual level is your Vijnanamaya kosha, and then on top of everything, at the very peak is your pure bliss and spirituality, your Anandamaya kosha. So all these are very different, but they are integrated. So it's really important to understand that these are concentric circles. So that means when you're at the state of bliss, you already have the other 4. And when you are at the state of intellectual capacity, you already have the other 3, and so on. So what's the takeaway here, right? The takeaway here is just that physical impurity out of a bodily level is not equivalent to an impure individual. So menstruation, like Brinda mentioned, like it's not an impure act. Menstruating women are definitely not impure. The Vedas were actually quite progressive. They understood this, and they were written with respect to the 5 layers mentioned. So therefore, when you cherry pick and pull things out of context and say things like menstruation makes a woman impure, it's just extremely irresponsible and factually incorrect, because the Vedas were written with respect to these layers. And to understand the Vedas, you need to understand the fact that we have 5 different layers of individuality.
Just a minute. My understanding is that this paradox emerged wherein on one side you had women as the Swarup of Shakti, and on the other side you had people believing that menstruation is an impure act. It adds impurity to the woman. She becomes impure during that time. How did this creep in? Is it primarily because there's been absolutely no understanding of the Shastras, or there's something else to it? What do you think about this?
So it's not about the fact that there's no understanding of the Shastras. There is a clear understanding of the Shastras for people who read it honestly. The misconceptions might arise in the translations. So a lot of our Shastras have been translated by European Indologists whose intentions in translating our Shastras were at best suspect and at worst malicious. And these mistranslations have happened many times. that have completely skewed the perspective on Hindu Shastras. And Hindu Shastras can say A, B, C, and the Indologist translations would say F and G and H. It would be that different. And Ashaucha is one such word. Colloquially, we'll all understand it if we speak Hindi, but others might not. And Ashaucha is just one word. But there are so many other words, paragraphs, whole books, in fact, that have been translated in such an inaccurate and negative way that it is bound to give rise to these misconceptions.
So wonderful hearing this from you, because I personally feel that Sanskrit is such a divine language that any other language falls short of an exact translation. I think they need to explain a word to really come to the essence of it rather than providing just one particular word for any term that Sanskrit uses. Okay, carry on. Yes. Sorry to interrupt you.
So, coming to how menstruation is actually viewed by the Shastras, the first way that menstruation is talked about is as a form of purification. So, it's a very positive purificatory process that women can use to purify three levels of their bodily existence. So, on the physical level, on the Annamaya Kosh level, it helps by removing excess endocrine lining, mucus, and other vaginal secretions. At the vital level or at the pranamaya kosha level, it helps in removing apana vayu, which is just excess vayu that has accumulated over time and which can lead to several emotional imbalances and several other negative emotions like anger and greed, like that. And similarly, at the manomaya level or at the mental health level, it removes mental impurities, like I said, anger, greed, frustration. All of these help are removed during the time of menstruation. So there's a purification that happens at these three levels. A point to note here is that there is no mention of the effect of menstruation on the remainder of the two koshas, which is the Vijnanamaya kosha or your intellectual level, and the Anandamaya kosha or your spiritual identity. What this basically means is that menstruation is simply a natural bodily process that is purificatory but has absolutely no impact on your intellectual capacity or on your spiritual capacity or spiritual identity. So, right away, this impurity business is thrown out of the window, again, multiple times. Now, coming to the second way that Hindu Shastras talk about menstruation, they talk about menstruation as a form of austerity or tapas. We all would have heard this word tapas or tapasya, in different contexts, but basically, very simply, it means a voluntary hardship or an austerity that you've undertaken in order to achieve some spiritual goal, or in order to enhance your dharmic identity, or in order to progress in the field of your dharma and increase your connection to God. According to our Shastras, the process of menstruation itself is a tapasya. So, undergoing menstruation is tapasya on its own. And this is where really the sensitivity of the Shastras comes out, because it recognizes the hardships associated with menstruation, and to almost acknowledge that and to enable those hardships to get converted into something much more positive, they help us to use menstruation as tapasya. And in the context of menstruation, what the tapasya is that the tapasya helps you to get rid of several vikarmas that you could have committed unintentionally. Vikarmas are basically negative actions or actions with negative consequences, and menstruation helps you get rid of these. Now, another charge that often gets leveled against Hinduism is that they seem to be a lot more rituals and practices ordained for men than for women. And the answer is given right here in the Dharma Sutras as to why that might be. Basically, women have a natural process by which they can achieve aspects of Shuddhi and then get rid of their vikarmas. But men don't have that. So men have to make that extra endeavor, and they have extra practices in order to get that same level of tapasya that women naturally have. And talking about the quote unquote purity of women, we see here that the Vashishta Dharma Sutra compares women and or the limbs of a woman to the back of a cow, the hump of a cow, and the feet of a brahmana, both of which are very revered and very holy in Hinduism. So there's no question of women being impure. So right away you can see the second way that the Shastras look at it as tapasya. Menstruation removes all connotations of being something evil or impure, because how can something which is so impure help you in your own spiritual journey, right? It could not be tapasya and austerity.
So the next way that Hinduism talks about menstruation, and the last way, is a period of rest. So we know from science and modern knowledge that women face a lot of discomfort during menstruation, sometimes as serious as endometriosis, which affects 10% of all women, or PCOS. So there are many scriptural precedents that talk about taking rest. And the notion of taking rest is very well recognized in the Hindu scriptures, and it is unique to Hinduism. And as a result, there are many traditional practices that are linked to communities trying to promote this idea of removing a woman from a working environment or an urban setting to ease her physical pain. So, what are the scriptural precedents here? We see that it is advised for women to resume work only after their monthly periods stop, which implies that they're recommended not to be working during their monthly cycle. Furthermore, in the Vasishtha Dharma Sutra, we see that menstruating women don't need to participate in any physical exertion of any kind. And very qualified commentators of the Vedas have even gone as far as to say that fathers who force their daughters during work during these periods, or harass them or negatively impact them, are comparable to animals. So here we see that Hinduism celebrates the idea of letting a woman be, letting her have rest so she can take care of herself. So, what does science tell us about menstruation, right? The idea that menstruation is critical for your women's health is completely recognized. And actually, yoga and Ayurveda were not opposed to this at all. So, there are specific books in Ayurveda focused on women's health, out of which many of them give healthy menstruation and regular cycles the utmost importance. So, right off the bat, we can see that the entire myth of painful periods are a result of your bad karma is completely thrown out the window. How can this be true if Ayurveda has treatments for painful periods and irregular periods? There are so many unique treatments based on your doshas, out of which the Rajaswala Parichaya is the most common and has a very high success rate.
Just a minute, Gayatri. I'm sorry I'm interrupting. But you know what? You just spoke about the importance of rest. But recently, as times have changed, we have working women, we have nucleus families. So, what do you say when a woman has to go to office and she has to prepare uh, food for everybody? She has to prepare boga for the deities. So, what do
Right.
you say? And she does it during her menstrual cycle. So,
Yeah, I completely understand. So right now in common culture, we're seeing the trend from joint families to nuclear families. And your question is about how nuclear families can help in a woman taking rest. So my response to that, as someone who lives in the West and has only seen nuclear families, right? The average household size in the US is 2.6 versus India 4.9. So from right there, we see that the entire idea of nuclear families is very common in the 21st century. Like I see my own mother, and during menstrual cycles, it's a little difficult. So what I think is the correct method, in my humble opinion, is that we have to start incorporating liberal values of fraternity, equality, and cooperation into our daily life. We can't expect to live in the 21st century that is so inundated with liberal values and refuse to pick up duty when it's needed, right? We can't want to be living in the 21st century and then not take the duty of living in the 21st century. So what can we do this? You just need to incorporate these values of equality and cooperation and respect into your household through the division of labor. So a lot of my friends in the West, we take up household chores that don't necessarily fill out, gender roles. Like I will mow the lawn, my brother will cook. Things like that make a very integrative and like flexible approach. So it's not that like your mother can't cook because she's unclean. It's just that she needs rest. And during this time, it's your job to pick up the slack. So I think using that perspective and that mindset is really helpful.
Wonderful, wonderful. But we are still living in a man's world. And I'm just going back a little bit, Brinda. You spoke about menstruation as a channel to relieve oneself of negative feelings like anger, etc. Now we hear comments like, "Oh, she's down and out, and she's irritated. Periods ho rahe honge, and she has these blues." I find them very misogynistic. Now, what do you have to say to that? Because that's the whole approach. Irritated hai, pareshan hai, periods ho rahe honge. Anything wrong with the periods ho rahe honge, and men say it. So,
Sure. We've all heard these, many times. And first of all, it's not always, we have to concede that it might not always be said with negative intentions. I mean, it is physiologically, biologically a fact that, women experience hormonal changes, and even the Shastras talk about apana vayu and things like that. So, and part of the process of purification is also the venting of these emotions. So we have to assume that not everyone says these with negative intentions. As far as how to respond to that, this my general rule, and even to some extent the rule of the Shastras, is be very utilitarian in terms of how you respond, because just see what works for you the best, or what impacts you in the most positive way. If correcting somebody, having a conversation with them, and especially this might be helpful if they are close family or loved ones or friends who you can be open with and you can be honest with, and then a conversation is more than often enough to help somebody understand why certain statements might be hurtful. In other times it might just be better to ignore, if it's just some random person or somebody you don't really value that much, or somebody who does is not so impactful in your life. So it's all about what the effect is on you. You should put your own health and your own mental sanity at the forefront of how to respond, and do and respond in a way that helps you be more positive in those regards. And just separating the intention from the statement is helpful also, because then you're not showing so much anger, but you can still express your hurt. So there are many psychological tricks that you can use, changing your perspective, whatever, even confrontation, if that's helpful, you know go ahead. So it's very contextual, it's very personal, and it has to be utilitarian. It has to be based on what works best for you and what will yield ultimately the best results for you. That's the only thing.
yeah, so I hope now the participants would understand why I said that you have a fan in me, because now it's so clear that your correct understanding and expression of your convictions comes with correct knowledge and correct understanding of that knowledge, which you are giving to us. So it's wonderful to have young teachers at this age. I wonder how it is to have older students, but yes, carry on.
Sure.
Yeah, Gayatri. Yes, please.
So the Hindu view can basically be summarized in this slide, which is that femininity is worshipped. There is a lot of inherent divinity in femininity itself. And as far as menstruation goes, there are three different principles by which the Shastras address menstruation. The first one is menstruation as a period of rest, which the Shastras really emphasize on, and they have instructions not just for menstruating women, but also for their family members about how they can provide for those women. So it includes things like making sure menstruating women have access to a clean bathroom, clean sanitary products, clean bed sheet, a comfortable bed, several books to read, and place to do her sadhana, and all of those things. These are ordained in the shastras that have to be provided or should be provided to women in menstruation, keeping in conjunction with menstruation being a time of rest. The second thing is menstruation as a time of austerity, or menstruation itself as tapasya, which helps you get rid of several vikarmas that you might have unintentionally committed. And the third is a means of purification at the physical level, at the pranamaya or the vital energy level, or and even at the mental level. So at all these three levels, it acts as a purification process. And so here clearly there are very positive connotations attached to menstruation as a process and to women who menstruate. And therefore, this word ashaucha, we can easily see how it's been so badly misappropriated and used in such a wrong and inaccurate way that gives rise to all of these false narratives that we have fallen victim to ourselves. um, so this was the Shastric view of menstruation. Now let's look at how the Shastric view has been translated into cultural India, or cultural practices. And one such thing is the concept of chaupadi. The literal translation of chaupadi is nothing but a separate room or a separate place or a separate structure for menstruating women. The image that you see on the far right is a Rajput Chaupadi. This is a very recent picture, so this actually exists. But this was like basically a separate palace built for royal women and queens who were menstruating. And as you can see, it pretty much adheres to what the Shastras ask of it. Cleanliness, it should be well lit, a comfortable bed, clean bed sheets, access to a bathroom, and sanitary products, all of that. The picture in the middle is a illustration. It's a painting of a scene in a chaupadi, and you can see women have gotten together. They're relaxing. They're talking. You can see a little child there as well, which means it's not meant to be a jail. It's like it's an active place. It's not dirty, a dungeon like place where you're locked up, but rather again it's the shastras are very utilitarian in this context. Do whatever works best for the menstruating women or helps her get the most amount of rest in the right way. Unfortunately, the concept of chopadi is also an example of how these shastric principles have degenerated over time. And you can see that in the picture on the extreme left, which is a chopadi in Nepal. Now, clearly, this is not the goal of Chaupadi, right? Nothing about this structure achieves anything that the Shastras would like it to achieve or that Indian culture would like it to achieve. And part of it is because of how Chaupadi has uh, evolved over the years. So we see that Chaupadi was initially practiced in such a grand way, like the way the Rajput Chaupadi is made. It was practiced in such a way only in very wealthy communities who could afford it and who could afford to provide all of these amenities for women. But then, as it got proliferated into other poorer sections of society, then naturally they could not live up to these standards, and unfortunately all that remained was structures that are dilapidated like the ones that you see in the bottom picture. It is worth mentioning, however, that there are several tribal villages, especially in Maharashtra, that still follow this principle of Chaupadi, except even though they're in a tribal village, the Chaupadi huts that they are some of the most beautifully made and some of the cleanest places of the entire village. So it's not just about the economy, but also about maintaining that understanding of why Chaupadis exist in the first place, and understanding the goal of a Chaupadi and then working towards that goal. And all Shastras by and large work like this, in terms of they have every time they give you certain action oriented principles, all those action principles are always associated with a much larger, higher goal that they are meant to accomplish. If the goal that is being that is meant to be accomplished is not accomplished by those action principles, then those action principles can be changed and can be modified, but the goal has to remain constant. So the goal here of providing women the right atmosphere so that they can fully perform their tapasya, they can fully experience purification, and they can fully rest, is not being accomplished by these chaupadis now. And so if it's not being accomplished, then those situations you can change these, these shastric action principles as well. So this was one of the negative cultural ways. But now let's look at some of the celebrations of menstruation that happen in Hindu culture and society. And starting with the northeast of India in Assam, just outside of Guwahati, with the Kamakhya Devi temple. Now, the speciality of this Kamakhya Devi temple is that the Devi is a menstruating goddess. And in fact, the main deity that is worshipped is the goddess's yoni, or the vulva or genitalia of the goddess. N- if so, even the genitalia is considered something that is worshipable in Hinduism, because we see inherent divinity in feminine form as well. And you know true to the principle of the shastras, when Kamakhya Devi menstruates, the doors of the temple are shut, and she's provided everything that she needs, including clothes, food, and even menstrual cloths, like I said, sanitary products. And at the end of the 3 days, the doors are opened again, and the white cloth that is left for her, the menstrual cloth, is now bright red with the blood of the goddess. And that menstrual blood soaked menstrual cloth is the Mahaprasad of this Devi, and this Mahaprasad is then widely distributed. So again, where is this concept of impurity that has come? This is just ridiculous. And if you can see, the statue on the picture on the right shows the statue of Kamakhya Devi. Clearly she's menstruating, and boldly so, and this is right outside the temple. So when the temple is shut, people can still worship the goddess in this carving. So there is so much divinity given to women, there is so much appreciation for the feminine form in Hindu shastras, that it is almost sad to see how it is being portrayed today. Now another cultural practice that is that takes place around Orissa is the festival of Rajaparba, which is a 3-day festival to celebrate Bhumi Devi's menstrual cycle. Bhumi Devi, or Mother Earth, is the consort of Lord Jagannath, who is the presiding deity of all of Orissa, if I do say so myself. But 3 days in a year, Bhudevi menstruates, and during those 3 days, again, to give Bhudevi rest, no agricultural activity takes place. Rather, it's a time for great celebration with special songs, dances, and most beautifully, women get together and decorate these swings using flowers and using leaves from Bhudevi. And this is in order to celebrate the fertility of Bhudevi as she menstruates. And men are active participants in all of these rituals, and all of these practices. So again, this is a huge celebration of menstruation. There is not at all a concept of denigration, or not considering something pure. All those concepts don't exist here at all. It is so nice, it's so nice to see this. And now, we'll go to the south of India as well, where Gayatri will take us through some more of these celebrations.
But this,
So
is,
now,
this has been quite an eye opener. And Gayatri and Brinda, from both of you, I just want you to say just a few words, maybe a sentence each, about what you understand. How would you explain the symbolism hidden in it? This distribution of the Mahaprasad, the menstruating Devis. It's amazing. Tell me, how do you understand the symbolism?
So to me, it basically represents Shakti, or Adi Shakti, because our Devis are embodiments of the principle of Shakti, or Shakti Tattva. And it shows how revered that Shakti Tattva in all women is, you know, and it shows how much women are under the care of these divine principles. You know, women cannot be second class citizens in a culture like Bharat, when women are considered so worshipable, when women are considered so reverable. And you know, and there, and not just like, for example, this is just related to menstruation, but even so many other practices like Kanya Puja only happens in Bharat. You will never find another country where Kanya Puja can happen, you know. So for me, it gives me so much satisfaction and so much belonging to this Bharatiya Sabhyata, which has almost it feels like it has taken me under its wing, under the shelter of this Shakti Tattva, and under the protection of these divine goddesses. So you feel this amazing oneness. And in terms of the symbolism, if the vulva of a goddess can be worshipped, then there is nothing about femininity that can be considered low or impure. You know, it is purity in its form itself. So that's my take on this.
I think it's feminism at its height, and the feminists in the Western world would benefit if they take a leaf or two out of this great revelation from our scriptures. Gayatri, your point of view, and then you carry on with your presentation. Yes.
Actually, something that really stood out to me and Brinda when we were putting this together was the Mahaprasad of Kamyakha Devi is her red menstrual cloth, and juxtapose that with the entire culture of buying feminine hygiene products. Buying feminine hygiene products in India or in the US is so taboo. Like, men don't go and buy them like freely. And second of all, if we look at like the ads we see in television, they have this like mysterious blue liquid, and just simply juxtapose that with how open and how welcoming Hinduism is regarding these things. Do you know what I mean? Like, the entire dichotomy exists in such a way that if you are falling prey to the idea that Hinduism is oppressive to women, you are just falling prey to the narrative created by colonialists and by people who have bad intentions. And that is something that me and Brinda were just fully shocked at when we were looking at this, because the idea that the West is so progressive and the East is not is just completely nullified right here. So that was something really beautiful for the both of us.
Carry on.
But yes, now coming back to Kerala in the south, so let's take it down south to Karnataka. And a similar festival to Raja Parba is Kedasa, where Bhudevi also menstruates, and it's celebrated in the villages. And during the menses of the earth, the women and men just don't do any work. They play and sing with their friends. And as Brinda mentioned, men are also active participants in these festivals, therefore completely taking away from the idea that men should have nothing to do with menstruation. Instead, this time is a time of celebration, and it's understood that when Bhudevi is menstruating, we should give her rest and therefore not continue our agricultural work, which is taxing on the earth. So, an example of how I personally felt that menstruation was celebrated in Hindu culture was the ceremony of the Hritikula Samskara. So this is performed when young girls get their first period, and I myself went through this. So they're gifted with many presents, and they're welcomed into womanhood, and they're worshipped with abhishek and haldi, and a lot of your family comes. And I found that living in America, the idea of getting your first period is very taboo, and it's a very hush hush. And then going home and telling my mom and dad, and then having them perform this samskara with my entire family, I was just so shocked as to how the two cultures were handling this topic so differently. Many conducts and norms in the West and industrial society believe that menstruation should remain hidden. However, Hinduism directly contradicts this because it celebrates this, right? So, what exactly is the purpose of the celebration? The entire purpose is simply to impart positive notions about menstruation to young women. These young girls are treated as special, and they're given gifts. And in fact, these girls are perceived to be manifestations of the supreme goddess themselves, and they're worshipped with arti. So the young girl is made to feel confident with her feminine identity. And the purpose of inviting your entire family is not to embarrass you, as the West would like to say. In fact, it's so that the elder women in the family, like your aunt, your grandmother, your mother, can share knowledge to help you become well adjusted to the oncoming physical and emotional changes of puberty. So that's so beautiful. So, with this information in mind, let's take a look at this paradox again. So, here we understand that women are highly regarded as and respected in Hindu society. However, there were notions that women were impure. We can completely change that narrative now because we can say that women are not impure. Women just have a temporarily bodily ashocha during menstruation that just gives them a unique opportunity for self care and spiritual growth. Brinda, was there anything you wanted to add?
No, I think we've covered this, in Shubhaji's questions as well, with regards to there is no question of impurity. Once we understand what the Shastras actually say, and once we understand and see in front of our eyes how women are celebrated and how menstruation is celebrated, it's all immediately gets rid of this entire narrative and immediately makes us see the divinity that Hinduism ascribes to menstruation itself, as well as, of course, femininity.
Yes. So now let's take a look at some contemporary context and how all the Hindus' scripture, cultural norms are reflected in the 21st century. So let's look at some testimonials, and these were real testimonials we received. So the very first one says, "My mother makes sure she's not getting her period before we plan a puja in the house." So this is just an example of how menstruation should be treated as a period of rest. The Shastras understand that a woman exert a lot of energy during the hosting and execution of a puja and might not be able to give 100% of their energy that they normally can give. So it's really important that we change the narrative from, oh, I can't host a puja because I'm impure, to I can't host a puja because this is a time for me to take rest. The next testimonial we have is that my mom chants and prays more during her period. This is just an example of how menstruation is a time of austerity. During this time, because there is no housework, ideally there should be no housework, women have more time to focus on themselves, which gives them the unique opportunity to work on their spiritual growth. Now, if you don't chant or pray more during this time, that's not a bad thing. The entire objective of the Shastras, like Brinda had mentioned, was to solve a purpose. And if you are not solving that purpose, then the president has no use, you have no use picking that up. So the entire objective is to take time to yourself. And if that means chanting and praying, good for you. So the next testimony we have is that my sisters wash their hairs on the fourth day of their period. Now, this is just indicative of self-purification out of a bodily level. It's just human nature to want to clean yourself thoroughly. So to indicate all the waste leaving your body, many women also wash their hair on the third or fourth day. And lastly, but not least, and the most highly debated testimonial is my aunt doesn't go to the temple on her period. Now, this is a prime example of people following rules without understanding why. So, temples are just institutions that propagate Shastric values. And the notion of taking rest is pivotal in the Shastric view of menstruation. So, the idea that menstruating women should not come to the temple is non-different than the idea that you shouldn't wear shoes in the temple, you shouldn't eat meat in a temple, you shouldn't come to the temple without bathing. Therefore, out of respect to an institution, women don't go to the temples during their cycle. Again, not because they're impure, but because this is a time for self-purification, austerity, and rest. And so, therefore, out of respect, women don't go to the temples during their cycle. Instead, they choose to worship at home because menstruation doesn't mean that your connection with God is severed. In fact, a lot of the rules in the Dharma Shastra recommend that you should pray and read more during your menses, that you should be reading and chanting during scriptures during your menstruation cycle. And a temple is just a third party institution that has its own set of rules. And as patrons of the temples, we need to respect that. But again, that doesn't mean your connection with God is severed. Your connection with God is never severed during Sanatana Dharma, and more importantly, never severed during menstruation.
And also, it's important to mention here that this is about a temple that has had its traditions and has had its specific way of worshipping deities for several generations. And so we respect that. However, if, for example, if you have deities at home, or if you're doing some kind of sadhana at home, then effectively you are the king and lawmaker, and it really makes no difference what you decide to do. So if your connection with your deity is still, if you still want to worship and still want to maintain it, there's nothing stopping you from doing that. It's already those that is ordained in the shastras themselves. So that's it.
Yeah, Brinda and Gayatri, each of these testimonials resonated with me because I've heard all of this while growing up.
Right.
But 21st century testimonials, it says something very intriguing and interesting about this country is that we are not living in the 21st century, we are living in 21 different centuries at the same time. And there are statistics which say that in the rural areas, there are still a large percentage of girls who do not go to school. They are told by their mothers or the elder ladies in the household, stay back, you're menstruating. So, in today's time and in the rural areas, how can we approach this topic of menstruation and give them the correct perspective? And there's a huge, huge, huge absence in the rural areas. I visited those areas 3 months back, and I found that this was the problem. Menstrual cycle sets in, ladki nahi aayegi. And when she returns, the boys will tease her.
Right. So again, here it's important to separate intention from the action. The intention of parents might genuinely be an honest way to protect their daughters, and an honest way to make sure, like you said, the daughters don't get embarrassed or don't face tough situations. But of course, it might have really bad consequences for the girls themselves who are going through it. So one definite approach that we can take is education, and education about shastras themselves, because these are by and large rural India dharmic communities, and uh, they have principles of Sanatan Dharma embedded in the everyday life, top to bottom. So if we can show them that these principles are not, if we can show them the accuracy of these principles in terms of what they accurately say about menstruation, rather than just believing something that has been said, or then adhering to a folklore or adhering to a tradition that might have been passed down over generations, then maybe though that education can help for sure. And otherwise it might just be a question of facility, like it might be in a way very elitist of us sitting here, with fantastic internet connections, being able to video conference across the world, and then sitting here and then passing judgments on rural India that we have no idea about in terms of what their issues are, what their struggles are. And maybe the solution relies in providing facilities for them. If these girls maybe had access to the right sanitary products, or um, the right clean bathrooms in school where they could be comfortable in, then that might itself solve the problem. So there are several different levels at which we can address these issues, and what works and what will not work will depend entirely on the specific community that we are addressing, because we can't make rural India into a homogeneous society or homogeneous community. There are such beautiful differences even between two neighboring villages that we'll have to take into consideration, and based on their specific environment, uh, introduce these principles in a way that is in conjunction with their lives that they are leading, but also at the same time works in the service of the progress of these young girls who might be suffering.
So something that really made me happy while I was touring these villages a couple of months back was, and we always criticize our government for this and that, I found that Swachh Bharat has reached the remotest of villages, and there are bathrooms, shauchalaya, very close to schools, And this film, Padman, has really made an impact. I found NGOs working actively to distribute sanitary napkins amongst girls and women there. And it was really heartening to see that. So I'm sure we would come up with solutions and help people as we go along. Yes, please carry on. Yes, please carry on.
So, one thing that I found quite amusing during our research was how we almost seem to be coming back to demanding what the Shastras recommend in the first place. And a large narrative of demands that has been going on with third wave feminism is that third wave feminists are now demanding menstrual leave, or from their work or their schools. On during their periods, they expect a few more days of leave compared to men. And well, this is clearly ordained in the Shastras, and you can see that when the Shastras talk about women should take rest, they need not work, and they need not exert themselves. And this often gets derided in our Shastric principles often get derided, but this is exactly what third wave feminists are asking for today, in the 21st century. So we almost seem to be coming full circle in that way.
So now let's look at some ads for painkillers specific to period pain. So both of these advertisements describe menstrual pain as something that is a nuisance or something that is wretched. So My Doll is a way to relieve you from menstrual distress, which is still sold today. And just juxtapose this with the Hindu view. In the Hindu view, menstrual cramps and mood swings are okay. Women don't need to overcome these symptoms because menstruation is just an organic and natural process. In the Hindu view, period pain is normal and you don't need to be a superwoman and do it all. Like the second picture exemplifies, that after she's taken this painkiller, she can cook breakfast again, as if not cooking breakfast would make her inferior or less of a woman. This is grossly opposed in the Shastras. They specifically say, let her rest. She does not need to cook for herself or others. Of course, this doesn't mean that you shouldn't take painkillers if you're experiencing extreme menstrual pain. This just means that we should educate ourselves and be aware of the fact that our scriptures were extremely progressive and accommodating to all needs, especially the needs of a woman.
And this was another article about the Kamakhya Devi temple that we found. And let me just read out one of the sentences from the article that is on the screen. It is believed that the Mother Earth becomes unclean for 3 days. It is then believed that Mother Earth has retrieved her purity. Now, just see this kind of misinformation that is being propagated. This is completely ridiculous, in my opinion. If the author had just bothered to do a little research or asked any one of the lakhs of devotees who come to the Kamakhya Devi Mandir, they would have immediately realized that the Mahaprasad of the Devi is her menstrual cloth. There is no question for her of her becoming unclean for 3 days. And look at this. This is purely a ritual of the tantric cult. Is that what Hinduism has been reduced to now? A tantric cult? Despite having a library of Shastras to refer to, despite having all levels of human existence dealt with in such great detail. I mean, this just shows a complete lack of research. And I'm not even talking about the intentions of this author, which immediately just reading these two sentences we can take a guess. But even if we give them the benefit of doubt and say that you had completely great intentions and you wanted to give an honest opinion on the Kamakhya Devi temple, this is clearly how much misinformation and how what negative narratives these people have fallen trapped to, that they are not even able to see what the actual Mahaprasad is. Just that fact negates this entire article. And unfortunately, this is just one article of several that have been published about Shastras, about Bharatiya culture, about Bharatiya Hindu Samaj, that portray it in such a negative light. And almost all of these articles are completely wrong. I'm not saying they're misinterpreting, I'm saying they're completely just wrong. Because this statement that Mother Earth becomes clean for 3 days is just factually wrong. So we a little research from on our part especially, can go a long way. Like, unfortunately, many Hindus don't know Sanskrit, including me. So we are relying on other translations and other commentaries, but we should definitely not rely on these mainstream media articles and mainstream media narratives. Let's at the very least do our own research when we form our own opinions about these issues. And so that's basically what we had to say. We saw this journey of what Hinduism actually believes menstruation is, and then how it got translated into everyone's day-to-day culture and lives, and sometimes in a positive way and sometimes in a very negative way, like some of the chaupadis in Nepal that we saw. But by and large, the culture around menstruation with regards to Hinduism is one of celebration, it's one of joyousness, it's one of appreciating and acknowledging the divinity that exists in all forms of femininity. It's about acknowledging the Shakti Tattva that exists in all women. And it's about maintaining a harmonious Samaj at the end of the day, and doing everything to make sure that the Samaj can live as comfortably as possible. So yes.
So
Yeah.
I got a little distracted because a couple of questions were coming up.
Sure,
And
sure.
before we conclude, I think we should answer these questions. And I have a concluding question coming in my head, so that I'll take up later. The question that has come up here is, how could these concepts be made attractive to convey to school students, especially in elitist schools?
Right. Which is an issue that we face with any kind of indigenous Bharatiya thought, or anything that is indigenous and Bharatiya, honestly. Because our school system is not at all Bharatiya at all. It's like imported from the Britishers in a really bad way. And a Western template put on an Indian mind is just a recipe for disaster. Because an Indian mind grows up in a different culture but studies in a different culture, and that just, that can really mess someone up. But one way to do it is focus on the contemporary context. Focus in maybe, like, if they're not so attracted to the Shastras themselves, then discuss the implications of those Shastric principles in everyday life and in today's time and with today's generation, with millennials and Gen Z, and maybe that can help bridge that gap.
Yeah.
Give it a very contemporary flavor, make it.
Yes, because Shastric principles at the end of the day can be applied in any time, place, or circumstance, irrespective of your context. Um, and these Shastric principles that we saw, they are so easy. They are so easy to implement here, like understanding menstruation as a tapasya, or enhancing my connection to God during that time, or doing certain, doing certain things or not doing certain things. They are so easy to translate into contemporary context. So if we can do that for these millennials and Gen Z students, then
Yeah.
they'll be able to connect better with it, because they can resonate with they can see the Shastras resonating with their own day-to-day lives.
Because we are going to deal with a generation which forget about Sanskrit, Hindi, and their own mother tongue.
Yeah. It's
All about
lowly if you
everything
speak
here.
Hindi in some of these schools. Yeah, definitely. And it's a huge hurdle that we'll have to cross. um, y- it's going to take some time. It's not going to happen immediately and overnight. We'll have to make some very fundamental systemic changes if that has to happen. And like any other systemic change, that will take a long time to implement. We very recently, the Hindu identity or the Bharatiya identity has gotten its own voice, and it's become little stronger over the past couple of decades. um, and as it gets even stronger, then we'll have more leverage, and we'll have more say in what our own systems look like, including our education system.
You're very right that the Hindu identity has got a voice, and our prayer is continuously that it goes in the right direction for the right issues, and because it's going to become a very potent force, and that's the only way we can give the future generation the correct perspective. Yeah. So coming to the second, yes, Gayatri. Sorry.
I was just going to add to the fact that, like, the speaking the mother tongue, it's, even though it's like considered lowly, I think educating your children and the people around you with the right narrative, like, for example, I was forced to speak in my mother language at home. If I spoke in English, my parents would be like, I don't understand what you're saying. So it's narratives like that. And everyone who's heard this menstruation presentation, please never again propagate the false narratives, because the media around us is already doing it for us. We don't need to do that. So all we have to do is speak the right narratives, and then you can educate everyone else around you. And slowly, again, I agree, it won't happen in a year, even 2 years. It might take 10, 15, 20 years for the narrative to be fully replaced with the correct narrative. But everyone has a little job, right? So that is the idea of propagating the right narrative, educating us, everyone around us.
So talking about the wrong narratives and the correct narratives, here's a question. Why are we not allowed to touch the deity during the menstrual cycle? And what is the responsibility of parents in this?
Sure. So, like we mentioned, so let's understand what the Shastras are. The Shastras basically give us principles, and it's up to Samaj to implement those principles based on their particular context. That's the beauty of Sanatan Dharma, that these Shastric principles can be implemented in different ways as per your own context, and as per your own unique situations. And that is what these different sampradayas have done over time. Each sampradaya implements the Shastras in a slightly different way. So, the same thing with any Sanatan ritual is that you have to see where, how it's come, where it's come from, and then see what the tradition around that is. And once we understand those specific things, and understand why those are being done, then those can be rectified in that particular space itself. Like, it is not on Sanatan, like Sanatan Dharma will never have these like blanket rules for everybody to follow. That's just not how it works, because it's very unnatural to do that. The context, people's contexts are so different, people are so different, that they will not achieve principles in the same way. So that is left to us, that is left to our guru shishya parampara, and that is left to individual sampradayas, and that is left to individual, to that extent, even to individual family units. So each family also will have its own special traditions, right? And a lot of these menstruation traditions fall under that category, um, of local or familial traditions. So that those have to be corrected at that level. They have to be corrected at that local, at that familial level, if they are
Shubhanshi,
being harmful.
yes.
Sorry, Gayatri?
No, I was just going to say, you had mentioned earlier that you asked why do the what whatever the scriptures say, why don't Hindus follow exactly that? Is that mistranslation? I also wanted to add a point that beyond mistranslation, a lot of the times what Hindus tend to do is give it a yes or no answer. But as Brinda had just mentioned, Sanatan Dharma doesn't have yes or no. By definition, Sanatan Dharma is not black or white. But what we tend to do at a sociological perspective in society is give everything a yes or no answer. So, along with mistranslations, we enter into a new realm of you cannot touch deities. There's nothing like that. Again, there are only three principles for menstruation: rest, austerity, and purification. And if not, doing deity service at home is directly a result of taking rest, then okay. But if it's not, that's also fine. So that's something I wanted to say again.
I'm talking about traditions at home. After all, mother is the the first teacher. So there begins the correct
Exactly.
of imparting education and the correct understanding and knowledge. Thank you so much for that answer, both of you. And Sanatan Dharma we were talking about. So there is a question here which is coming up, and it says, is it that uneven gravitational force in Sabrimala has harsh effect on menstruating women, and hence they are restricted?
Okay, so let me answer this let me rephrase the question a little bit. What is the connection between Sabrimala and menstruation, right? And the answer is nothing. The non-entry of women of a certain age into the Sabrimala temple has absolutely nothing to do with menstruation. It has everything to do with the deity itself. The deity over there is Ayyappa Swami in the form of a Naishtika Brahmachari. One of the rules that a Naishtika Brahmachari has to follow is avoid contact with people of the opposite gender of a certain age. And that is exactly what women have adhered to over the years. And actual devotees of Ayyappa Swami, actual women devotees, don't really care about this because they have several other Ayyappa Swami temples that they can go to, some of which actually have women priests only, and men priests are not allowed. So it's a non menstruation is a non issue when it comes to Sabrimala. It's all about the age of the woman. If there was a 35-year-old woman who's had a hysterectomy and therefore does not menstruate at all, she still will not go in that temple because she still falls in that age bracket. So as far as I have not studied the magnetic fields around the Sabrimala temple, so I cannot make an educated statement on those. But what I can tell you about menstruation and Sabrimala is there is absolutely no connection.
Yeah. So the gravitational, the magnetic fields are existing, but here is the misconception which has been created.
Right. Whether the fields exist or don't exist, whether they're harmful or non-harmful, Ayyappa Swami women devotees will not enter that one particular temple of Ayyappa Swami while they are in of a certain age.
They are entering several other temples of Ayyappa Swami elsewhere.
Exactly. There are so many other temples of Ayyappa Swami where he's not a Naishtika Brahmacharya. So all people can go freely, including women. So it's a complete non-issue in my opinion.
Yes, I know that. So that's a very fierce issue, very
Yeah.
debatable issue, and
Yeah,
people
in fact, menstruation
are
was
all
stupidly
kinds of.
mentioned in the actual charge sheet that, or the actual case that was filed. In the legal documents, they said, oh, because menstruating women are not allowed. But that's not true at all. It's about the age of a woman and it's about respecting the Naishtika Brahmacharya Vrat of the deity of Ayyappa Swami in that particular temple.
Now we're talking about temples. Here's a question which says, and I say, forget about temples. The question is more relevant here because there are families where the women are not allowed to enter the kitchen. Is it rest or is it some other thought process going on?
So the initial impetus would definitely have been rest. The origin of this would have been rest. Unfortunately, it might have degenerated over time to be just unnecessary discrimination. And this trajectory is similar to the Chopadi trajectory, where it started off with the best intentions, with the right approach, but then later on in certain parts took on like really negative connotations and a really negative, harmful trajectory. And some of these issues are like that. In one way it can be seen as, oh, this is a time of rest, but at the same time, it's not like a hard and fast rule. Like not taking rest is not going to give you papa. It's not going to somehow make you less in the eyes of God or in the eyes of the Shastras. The only consequences of not following the principles of rest are that you won't get rest. That's the only consequence. There are no other karmic consequences, or there's no God waiting with a thunderbolt ready to strike down on you the minute you step into that kitchen. Hinduism does not work that way. Our Shastras don't work that way. It is simply a recommendation, a guideline. And again, the Shastras are very utilitarian. They have, every action principle that you undertake has to follow has to be in the service of a higher goal that you want to achieve. And as long as that higher goal is met, then continue those action principles. If that higher goal is not being met, then those principles need to be modified.
You have been talking about the Shastras and the guidelines given there. Here's a question which says, I had read something on the lines of how a woman's Kundalini is affected when she's menstruating and if she enters a temple. Because the temples are based on energy locations, nothing on the lines of any impurity. So can you throw some light on this?
So there are some, in our research, we did come across several articles and several commentaries that said, that it's to do with the specific energy structures of the temple vis-a-vis the specific energy structures of a menstruating woman. But there is no general consensus on it. In terms of the Shastras, they give us a general direction of women's energies in terms of, you have excess apana vayu, your rajas shakti is much higher when you menstruate, and things like that. So they give us these general principles, but they don't exactly talk about what those very specific energy changes would look like, or at least the Shastras that we research. Like, we cannot definitely speak for like the whole Shastric library, but the ones that we researched didn't go to that specific level, although there are different commentators that have different views on this issue. So there are multiple perspectives on this, like, in terms of and sometimes they agree and sometimes they don't. So I'm really not sure, and I'm really not sure exactly what energy structures are of temples. That would require a much deeper analysis at a vastu level, at an architecture level, and on those things. So but I am sure that could be the case also, because your pranamaya kosh has a huge impact and is impacted by menstruation itself, right? We talked about it, um, in terms of how it purifies the prana, but your prana is at the same time, it changes when you menstruate. So there can be those connections made as well.
Anything you have to say, Gayatri, on this? Anything to add to this?
I just wanted to go back to your previous point about how mothers are the number one educators. And if you are telling your daughter, don't enter the kitchen, you're impure, I want to say that that's a mistake. You should be saying the opposite of that. Menstruating doesn't make you impure, but don't enter the kitchen because we have our set rules, or this is how we follow, these are our sampradayas. And similar to temples, I think elders around us, like we saw in the Hritikala Samskara, right? That the elders of the family come to impart notions about menstruation that are not always reflected in how the people around us talk about it. So similarly, whether it's temples, whether it's deity service, whether it's cooking, the people around us, educated people around us, need to propagate the correct narrative.
Wonderful. So I want to end with a question, but I must read this. Somebody has said, you both have definitely started the process of educating us. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's something I wanted to say. And it's so wonderful. But tell me, in this process of research, in this process of coming to terms with the truth, trying to find it out, what the truth is, what were your takeaways? What were the two things? Yeah.
Right. So when we were reading about Hinduism, we also read about other cultures. And something that stood out to me was that our scriptures are so sensitive. Like that, if I can describe our scriptures in one word, I would just say that they're sensitive. Every single case is noted. Every single person is accounted for. In fact, trans people are accounted for. Members of the LGBTQ community are accounted for in Hindu scriptures. And that's something that Brinda and I were very pleased to see, considering that that's not what we always hear in the world. And I wanted to also say that even though the narrative around us might be negative, the fact of the matter is that the scriptures are always so positive, and just reading the scriptures at an objective level will give you such happiness.
Yes, exactly. My takeaway was very similar to Gayatri's, the beauty of the Shastras, the nuance that is present in the Shastras, how it's able to so beautifully reconcile emotions and at the same time actions and emotions and intellect and physical processes with your emotional states and physical rituals with the intentional spiritual growths associated with it. So those reconciliations and those bridges that we found with menstruation were really illuminating in terms of the depth of the Shastras and the breadth of the Shastras and the openness of the Shastras, how honestly they discuss topics and how not at all worried they are about talking about anything.
I remember talking about this. I think we were having a conversation, and you mentioned about temples being institutions and each different institution having its own set of rules. So those rules necessarily could not, might not conform with the uh, truth expounded in the Shastras. If that is what, did I understand that correctly?
No, so basically, temples are the embodiments of Shastras in one way. They take the Shastras and translate it into a physical space that people can experience spiritual growth in. um, and they also served many other purposes. They served as markets, oftentimes they served as places of social gatherings, of cultural, of dance, of music. All of those arenas happened within the temple itself. So these temples have had their specific purposes and have had their traditions for generations. And in respect to those traditions that have been instrumental in the formation of the institution of that temple, we can respect the temple and its traditions. And therefore, if a temple has certain rules about menstruating women not entering, then we can respect that. The same way the temples will have rules about you must always have a bath before you come into the temple, you should not have done these xyz things before you come to the temple. All of these, temple will maintain its own shastric standards, and we as outsiders can respect those institutional standards the same way we respect institutional standards everywhere, right? We respect the institutional standard in schools of wearing uniforms and wearing a hair a certain way and wearing certain kind of shoes. Those, it's that kind of a thing. It's not necessary, it's very specific to that institution. um yes.
A lot of compliments coming your way, so I'm not the only one. And there's a participant who's written that my daughter was listening to this, and she's 21, and she felt elated by the knowledge you all shared with us. So,
We're so glad. That is our main objective, that was our main objective, to get the actual accurate perspective of the Shastras to people so that they can understand it.
and another message says, "Thank you, Brinda and Gayatri. Awesome respect to scriptures and its understanding."
Thank you
So,
so
Thank
much.
you so much.
I think this is your real reward. And uh, before we conclude this, I'd just say I'm completely overwhelmed. It's been a learning experience for me, and it has triggered that curiosity, that eagerness to know more, and ye dil mange more. So,
Thank you so much, Shuvaji, for those wonderful introductions, first of all, in the beginning, and
you
then
deserve so much.
prodding us with these questions that made us think also, and hopefully explain ourselves better.
I couldn't have done any better because my knowledge is very limited as compared to yours. And I had to really struggle to be, sound, not sound silly when I have such aware children right there in front of me as my teachers. And another thing that I would like to tell you is, in this process of trying to think about menstruation, and I was given this task, which has been a great privilege and an honor for me to have come to this seminar as a moderator, and I wanted to be quieter because I didn't want to show how inadequate I am. I saw a couple of videos and I realized that there are quite a few women who are working towards understanding the Hindu scriptures and the correct perspective and how progressive Indian culture is. And to my pleasant surprise, and I found that there's a particular Christian lady who's made a great deal of progress in this direction. To you, my request would be that you make such a good team. Please put many such videos on YouTube. There are lots and lots of youngsters waiting to lap it all up. And we are there to, understand more and give it to the younger generation. As a teacher, my request would be that continue to do this good work, put up more videos on YouTube, come up with more seminars. And I think Pavitra would be only too happy to host you again. And we're waiting for many such seminars with you, with different kinds of topics. We talk about it. And thank you so much for this enlightening seminar. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having us here.
So to our menstrual buddies, I can just say, let's create our own rules. Let's have a cup of jasmine tea. Let's sit comfortably in our rooms and listen to soothing music. Rewind, replay, whatever Brinda and Gayatri have said. Have this video there, download it on your mobiles, listen to it again and again, and have a great understanding of what our scriptures have to say. और फिर इसको समाप्त करते हुए जहां से हमने शुरुआत की थी, निसर्ग सिर्फ तूफान नहीं, प्रकृति का भी दूसरा नाम है। ये निसर्ग पवित्र हो, ये पवित्र के प्लेटफॉर्म से मैं कहना चाहती हूँ। हमारे विचार पवित्र हो, हमारा शरीर पवित्र हो, हमारे कर्म पवित्र हो, आपका दिन पवित्र हो, आपका जीवन पवित्र हो। इसी मंगल कामना के साथ आप सभी से हम विदा लेंगे। नमस्कार।
नमस्कार।